here now. Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning and welcome to the Illinois Holocaust Museum. My name is Ruben Brand and I am privileged to serve as the Rosh Kollel of our YU Torah Mitzion Kollel. As many of you know, our Kollel is a community learning enterprise here in Chicago. And the truth is that thank God, in the last 12 years, the Kollel has continued to grow in many creative new ways. What is at the core a group of rabbis who are learning and teaching, that's what you would call the Kollel, the YU Torah Mitzion Kollel, has expanded to also serve new elements, new areas of our Jewish community. One of our new initiatives in recent years has been kneeling, serving the women of our community. And then we have another initiative that spans the greater Chicagoland Jewish community beyond the Orthodox community, that the Kollel is most directly associated. And we call that effort the Midwest Center for Jewish Learning. Well, it's thanks to the efforts and the relationships in the context of this Midwest Center for Jewish Learning that we have the opportunity to be here today for the first time under the aegis of the Illinois Holocaust Museum to provide a live virtual tour of the Kharkomi permanent exhibit. It's the relationship of MCJL and the Illinois Holocaust Museum that's making this possible. But it's not really an institutional relationship, it's a personal relationship. And we thank personally, individually, Kelly Zaney, Amanda Friedman, Wendy Singer, and all of the docents who have shaped and formed this partnership in recent years. It's been an opportunity for us to partner with the museum in offering education for the museum docents as well as the broader community. And in that context, we are delighted to share this morning with you. We're going to begin right now through the doors behind me. We're going to be walking through the Kharkomi permanent exhibit. This will take a little bit less, hopefully almost 2 hours. So get something to drink, take a seat, and we're going to get started right now. Welcome, and welcome. When you come to the museum, which is now open on a limited basis, you're going to see various videos through the exhibit, which we're not going to stop at right now, and the museum actually turned off for our benefit the audio, but just so you'll get a sense, this is the beginning of the exhibit. It's a general capture. The question begins with why. Everything begins with why. Why are we here? Why are we studying together? Why are we visiting this museum? Well, on one level, the why is understanding history more broadly. Why is it important to study history? Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zecher Tzaddik Lebracha pointed out in an essay that the study of humanities, the study of history, introduces us to the Tzelem Elokim, to understanding the human condition. Part of this story, why do we study this, is to understand the suffering of our people, of Am Yisrael. And that suffering has an awareness, just like when the Ribono Shel Olam several times, more than 20 times, tells us, remember what it was like being servants in Egypt, therefore you should think about how you treat the stranger. We too are studying our story, our history, the study of the Shoah, to remind us of what that experience was like and how we think about treating others. In addition, what does it mean that we can do? What's our responsibility in light of this enormous, unimaginable, and indescribable tragedy? The Rambam writes, Maimonides teaches us in Hilchos Tanis that when something calamitous happens, we need to introspect. Not that we're prophets and we know necessarily why something happened, but we need to think, what does it mean for us and how do we improve? And lastly, it gives us an opportunity for inspiration. Over the course of this morning, I'm going to have the opportunity to share with you stories, books, and individuals. This morning, I begin with this volume. Some of you may be familiar with. It's called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust by Yafa Eliach. Aleh HaShalom. Yafa Eliach does an incredible job of collecting stories, inspirational stories that are amazing for those who are going to be looking for something to read and learn on Tisha B'Av. This is a great place to start. She begins with a quote from the Blusha Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Spira, who himself was a survivor and is featured in many of these stories from the Janowska work camp and other places. He says, every day we should learn about the Holocaust, based on the pasuk in the Chumash that will happen to us. Day shall come to pass when many evils and troubles are to come upon them, that this song shall testify before them as a witness. The suffering and the testimonies, when told by Holocaust survivors, are a song, a hymn of praise, a testimony to the eternity of the Jewish people and the greatness of their spirit. We're going to tour this museum and share stories because they are a source of inspiration, chizuk, and guidance for us. When we are looking to connect, to be closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can hold on to their coattails, as is described in one of these stories. Not for today. Come join me. The first part of the exhibit, as you see behind me, is a little bit of a snapshot of what they call Jewish life before World War II. Now, one thing that I think is important to keep in mind when we think about this section of the exhibit, this is not a Jewish museum, and it's certainly not a religious museum. It's not an anti-religious museum. It's just a general museum with a general audience. And one of the things that we can remember when we think about the idea of Jews before the war is that it was a very varied experience. So if you see on the wall here, there are lots of different Jewish artifacts. There's a Sefer Torah here, which is an interesting question about whether it should be kosher Sefer Torah buried. Geniza, there's a Sefer Torah which is kept here. Shabbos candles, other Judaica, shofar. These are representatives of traditional Jewish living, of course. But the truth is that this one small snapshot, it cannot and it does not capture the complexity, the texture of the Jewish communities before the Holocaust. There were all different kinds of Jews in Eastern Europe. There were big city Jews, places like Warsaw, Lublin, lots of big cities. And then there were small town, shtetl Jews. There were Hasidim and there were Misnagdim, non-Hasidim, you could call them, Lithuanian Jews who were not motivated and inspired by Hasidus. There were Bundes Jews, secular Jews, all different kinds of Jews who you will find with different experiences. So it's important not to paint the entire Eastern European, or even, of course, the entire European Jewish experience with one brush. But more than that, this life, this entire Jewish experience has a significant perspective that we need to tap into. And some of that exists today and some of that is lost. If you were to go back pre-war, 100 years ago, and find your way to a woman who walked in the morning to the local butcher, the local shochet, who would slaughter a chicken and give it to the woman, she would take it home. She would cook the chicken. She would salt the chicken. Do we know how to salt the chicken today? I'm going to ask the question. In those days, when a woman salted a chicken, did she learn the laws of Melicha? Did she study the book, the Shulchan Aruch, where it teaches you how? No. She had an art, a Jewish practice, a halakhic mode of living that was not really book learned, but it was learned mimetically from her own mother. So number one, today, many of these halachos, because we live in such a modern industrialized community, we don't know the laws of salted chickens. Many of us, I should say. But more than that, what does it mean to have a mimetic tradition? To see parents and grandparents who are following a particular path in Avodas Hashem and connecting to godliness. That's something which was ubiquitous, not exclusive, and nothing we're going to say today applies to everyone, but it was certainly very common before the war, a mimetic tradition just for the average, simple, pious, observant Jew. On the other hand, this pre-war European experience was a place of rarefied Torah scholarship. Only a handful, several thousand out of the millions of Jews studied in yeshivot, in elite Torah institutions, citadels of tradition, where they poured day and night over traditional Jewish texts and Jewish learning. And from that became the ultimate eyes of the Jewish people, as the Talmud says. The sages are our Einei Ha'eda, the eyes, and they illuminate, they give us the vision and the direction that we're going. Well, that's also something that was lost in many regards. There were thousands of Talmudic scholars, geniuses, and some of them we're going to have the opportunity to meet today, who are no longer living, who did not survive the war, and much of their Torah, not just them, but their Torah is also lost. Thinking back what it means to connect to that tradition from a rabbinic standpoint. And that's something that we're going to reflect on through this experience today, thinking about the common man, but also thinking about these great giant luminaries who we can grasp onto for inspiration. So the beginning tells us a little bit, teaches, it gives us the perspective on pre-war Europe. But then we go into the political rise of Nazism in Germany, 1933, which is, if we had video, we would be looking at the video on the left side. What I would encourage you to do is look down this corridor, look down the hallway. As you'll notice, on the right side, you see the gray, jagged design, and on the left side is more of a warm brown, rounded edges. What the museum is trying to convey is that with the onslaught, and this first section is in red, and you'll see if you look on the side, Nazi marches. This is the rise of Nazism. It's pictured in red, huge rallies. So this was followed by essentially a two-tier period, two planes. On the one hand, there was persecution. In the Nazi rise to power, there was terrible persecution of Jewish communities. You see here on the right-hand side with the Nuremberg laws, Jews with signs, people thrown out of businesses, Nazi armbands. But on the right-hand side, you'll see the flourishing of Jewish life in Germany under the Nazi rule. So this is a famous iconic photograph of the menorah with the Nazi symbol, the swastika outside. There's a ksuba here on this wall. In this context, you have an amazing confluence that on the one hand, there was terrible persecution. On the other hand, there was Jewish revival and Jewish living. I want to introduce you now to a man. Take a look on the screen. Rabbi Isaiah Wolgemuth. Rabbi Wolgemuth wrote this sefer, which I'm going to share with you right now. You can take a look on the screen. You're going to see Rabbi Wolgemuth's face. Rabbi Wolgemuth was a student before the war in the seminary, in the rabbinical seminary, the Beis Medrash LaRabbanim in Berlin, known as a tremendous yeshiva. It was in Central Europe, of course, and so it had a different, in addition to being a different geography, it also had a different orientation than Eastern European yeshivas, which were Torah only. Here, there, and specifically Gemara only. Here, there were also other aspects of Torah which were introduced, like the learning of Tanakh or Dikduk. Many of the scholars, the rabbis who learned here, we'll reference one of them shortly, had themselves other secular degrees. They provided rabbis for communities throughout Germany. This Rabbi Isaiah Wolgemuth, who you're looking at on the screen, became the rabbi to succeed his father, Rabbi Joseph Wolgemuth, in a small German community in 1935. Rabbi Wolgemuth's father passed away, and he became the Rav at a very young age. So let's come back to the screen here. I want you to see this book. Rabbi Wolgemuth, after surviving Kristallnacht, escapes to America, immigrates, arrives in Boston, and he begins teaching in the Maimonides Day School with Rabbi Joseph E. Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik invited him to teach shiurim in Tefillah. So this sefer is called Guide to Jewish Prayer. In the introduction to the Guide to Jewish Prayer, Rabbi Wolgemuth tells you about his experience being a Rav in Kitzingen, Germany. And he tells you something very unexpected. He said, I have classified the years from 1933 to 1939 as another golden age in Jewish history. Golden age in Jewish history. This is a rabbi who is in a community not far from Würzburg in 1935 and saying that it's a golden age. What does that even mean? I don't understand. How can you say that, he says? You might think it's strange to refer to those years as a golden age. Are they not the beginning of the Hitler period, years of tragedy, the years that immediately preceded the Holocaust? They were years in which the Jewish people were deprived of all basic rights and classified as second-class citizens. I lived through these years and think of them very often. You should know there's a survivor who volunteers their time here in the Holocaust Museum, who lives in Indiana, who is from Kitzingen, who remembers the levaya of his father, Rabbi Joseph Wolgemuth, who remembers him as the rabbi of this community. And Rabbi Wolgemuth says, those were unusual times. He says the most significant aspect of this period, however, was our ability to study Jewish texts and observe the great spiritual heritage of our ancestors. That's what was going on in Germany in the 1930s. The political oppression of those years might have frustrated most people in the world, but it did not frustrate the Jews of Germany, who, in spite of all the obstacles, difficulties, and hardships, dedicated all their free time to learn Torah in the widest sense in the world. I was busy, then he gives you about his background and where he was learning the Beis Medrash LaRabbanim. He says, suddenly, everyone in my congregation wanted to learn Torah Shebitzav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. I was busy every hour of the day, and what happened in my congregation happened all over Germany. The most assimilated Jews wanted to increase their knowledge of Jewish studies. There was a tremendous search for knowledge that was unequaled in Jewish history. He talks about scholars. Then he says the Orthodox community, the monks, the Wolgamuts, the Kohls, the Breuers, Biebersels, Freimans, Kaba. These are all famous rabbinic names and communities throughout Germany. They taught Talmud virtually all day long. The highlight of the week in every Jew, every community, was the weekly sermon of the rabbi. Today, says Rabbi Wolgamut, who passed away in Boston several years ago, people are rarely eager to hear rabbi sermons. In those days, nobody wanted to miss one word of the rabbi's ideas, both in the Orthodox community and in the liberal congregation. Some of those sermons I delivered in those days are still fresh in my mind. That's how people reacted. The average, ordinary person came back and embraced their Yiddishkeit, their Avodah Shalom learning more than before. As we walk a little further, I'll introduce to you the next figure who you can meet on your screen, known as the Sridei Eish Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. The Sridei Eish was one of the greatest rabbinic luminaries of the generation, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva, the dean of the Beis Medrash Rabbanim, of where Rabbi Wolgamut studied. The Sridei Eish happened to be in Warsaw, but because he was in Berlin, then he ended up in Warsaw at the beginning of the war, but because he was a Russian citizen, he was actually spared from deportation and sent to Germany, where he was put in a labor camp for the duration of the war, which he survived, and then ended up in Switzerland for the remainder of his life. Unfortunately, his life was shattered. His entire world, all of his rabbinic colleagues, his students, his yeshiva, all of his learning had been destroyed by the Germans. And so he led the rest of his life kind of in a quiet, solitude fashion, writing and interacting with Jews around the world from Switzerland, but mostly by pen. He was a broken man who had married but had no children and was living single most of his life, even though he married early on. The Sridei Eish, now you come back to take a look, the Sridei Eish, Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, wrote tshuvas, responses that we call Sridei Eish, the remnants of the fire. One of those tshuvas gives insight to what was going on at that time. Sridei Eish was asked a question by a community in Germany. Rabbi Weinberg, what do we do? All of the cultural places of gathering are now closed. Is it permitted to host a concert in a synagogue? Can you use a sanctuary, a heichal of a Beis HaKnesses, as a place for a concert? And so there's a lengthy tshuva in the Sridei Eish, there's a lengthy response, but what this tells us is that the Sridei Eish and other rabbanim of the time in Germany were dealing with and addressing halakhic considerations. So he's marshaling all of his halakhic expertise, but it shows us something about what people cared about and what they were focused on during that time, during that oppression. It was building their sense of identity, of connecting to each other with the halakhic sensitivity of not to do something that would contravene the Jewish law. So on the left side here, we're passing by more artifacts. These are from Shanghai. We're heading into 1937, 1938, the Evian Conference. We're now entering into the next phase. You see these various documents on the wall, examples of passports, because there were many Jews who were trying to get out of Europe at this time, but so many countries, their gates were closed to refugees. There was a famous conference, the Evian Conference, but did not lead to great results. So most Jews, the vast majority of Jews, were trapped in Europe. November 1938, you see in this room, this is the imaginary facade of a shul. Here you have Jews, pictures of Jews cleaning up glass, and here you actually have, if you can see behind me, you'll see in a minute, a burnt scroll. What is the scroll? It's a Megillah Esther, saved from the fire, November 9th and 10th. As we know, this is referred to as Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Tens of thousands of Jews in a coordinated pogrom are rounded up and taken away by the Germans and put in what was at that time concentration camps. I'll turn your attention to the screen to meet an incredible Rav, whose picture I do not have. He's known by the appellation as the Menachem Meshiv. That was the author of the Sefer that he published before the war, Rav Menachem Mendel Kirschbaum. Rav Kirschbaum grew up was educated in Poland, but became a Rav in Frankfurt and served the community in Germany and wrote letters to Jews all over the world concerning all kinds of halakhic questions, including in this period, dealing with issues of ritual slaughter of shechita that was being curtailed by the authorities. Rav Kirschbaum ultimately was captured by the Gestapo and sent to Auschwitz and murdered. And that's why on the top you see there's the Hashem Yikom Domo Zchus Yoven Lein, whose marriage should be for a merit for all of us. Rav Kirschbaum, he was asked a very painful question. And that's the Kuntras, the little pamphlet that you see on the screen. He published a pamphlet of what to do with ashes. Because there were many Jews, unfortunately, whose relatives, whose fathers or brothers or sons were taken away to Dachau or other concentration camps in Germany after Kristallnacht. And what did they receive weeks later? A box of ashes. What does one do? What does the halacha ask of us when it comes to a box of ashes? So they turned to the Gaon, Rav Kirschbaum, and said, what do we do with these? And he published this Kuntras, which you see the title page in front of you, how to deal with the ashes of those who were cremated in the wake of this pogrom in 1930. We continue on with the political next steps, which are documented here in the museum. As we walk through, you see the Chicago and New York newspapers talking about what was happening politically. On the left side here of the museum, there are examples, and one of the beautiful things about this Illinois Museum is that the vast majority of the artifacts here are from local survivors and families. The St. Louis, other attempts of Jews to emigrate from Europe, but so many walls were closed, as it says in your exhibit, paper walls. The next section of the exhibit is focused on the beginning, the outbreak of World War II. And these videos describe the German blitzkrieg and the onslaught of Germans pouring into Poland. And now all of a sudden, as you'll see on this map behind me, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that split Poland in half. And now the western section goes to the Germans, the right section goes to the Soviets. So now millions of Jews are now either under Stalin or Hitler, in this new experience. And this changes the reality. It's right before the Yom Noraim of 1939. We move a little bit forward as one stage of the Holocaust is being revealed for us here in the museum, and it's known as the T4 program. It was the German program to essentially extinguish, to destroy all those people living in Germany with disabilities. And here is a good opportunity to reflect on the difference in the philosophy of Germans and Nazis in that orientation versus the Torah perspective. And so Jonathan writes in several places in his books, Avram Avinu, he came to teach the world that might is not right. Ethics, morals, the Ribono Shel Olam, that is what determines what's right. But for the Germans, for the Nazi outlook, it all was about the utilitarian will to power, the strong over the weak. And whoever mattered in that scheme was valued. And whoever was not somebody who had a disability, they were destroyed. As opposed to in Yiddishkeit, if every person is created, every human being and every Jew is B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, then it doesn't matter what disabilities a person has, they're going to be enveloped. They're going to be brought into the circle. I had the opportunity to walk through this museum with lots of amazing people. One of them is a member of our community who has a daughter with special needs. And when we got to this point in the museum, she began to cry. It was obviously an extremely emotional moment for her. But she reflected to me afterwards about how much love and support and how beautiful it is to be part of this community, how much we have to celebrate and to be proud of. The Germans quickly occupied soon both the Eastern Front, but also France, Belgium. You see here in the museum a picture of Hitler walking in Paris. And this is the influence of the Germans now essentially throughout Europe. France is going to be divided into two halves, but we now have a new phenomenon. forward. And you see this is the ghetto. We're gonna enter now into the section of the museum. You see the imaginary brick wall, and anybody who's not Jewish is forbidden to enter. This is a new section of life for Jews in more than 1,000 ghettos across Europe. A ghetto comes from the Italian word ghetto, likely, which means foundry. The first ghetto was in Venice, where there was a foundry, so that's why the word means it was a contained area where people were locked in. So there was a policy of containment, a way for the Germans to house all the Jews in one area. Some of these ghettos were, thousands, tens of thousands of people. The Warsaw Ghetto, which was less than a few square miles, at its height had almost 400,000 Jews, but some ghettos were very tiny. When the Germans came in to Poland, they covered Poland in less than 6 weeks. They started to organize the Jewish communities, but let's say it didn't happen in the ghetto immediately. The ghetto from Warsaw didn't start for a year, but essentially within a year or so, the vast, almost all Jews, unless they were hiding, were ghettoized. So what was the ghetto experience? So if you follow down, the ghetto was characterized, unfortunately, by overcrowding, by hunger, and by disease. And yet, despite this, there was an incredible effort and accomplishment of the Jews to get together in so many places as communities to help other Jews. It was almost like a bizarre situation of some normal life, but also death and destruction just all around us. I'll turn your attention to the screen for a moment to introduce you an exceptionally unbelievable person. His name is Rav Shimon Huberband. Rav Shimon Huberband was a member of the Oneg Shabbos Ark, together with Emanuel Ringelblum, who was in charge of this. Emanuel Ringelblum decided they were going to collect information and document all of the comings and goings, all of the events and the atrocities that were perpetrated. And they were going to save these for perpetuity, even though Ringelblum did not survive, and the members did not survive, but many of the documents did. Rav Shimon Ben was a member. He was not just a rabbi and a scholar and an author, he was a member of the Oneg Shabbos archives. So now if you come back here, you'll take a look. I have a book. It's a translation, the original Yiddish you can get. Yad Vashem will actually share with you. I had the opportunity, thanks to some research at Yad Vashem, to actually see the mimeograph sheets of the original Yiddish of Rav Shimon Huberband. This book is called Kiddush Hashem, Jewish Religious and Cultural Life in Poland During the Holocaust. His job, Rav Shimon Huberband's job, was to document religious life in the war. So at the beginning, he describes what it was like during Yom Noraim, during Rosh Hashanah, during the Blitzkrieg and Yom Kippur. And later he describes life in the Warsaw Ghetto. He describes unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. He has a chapter here on Jewish women and their devotion to the observance of mikvah. Because all the mikvahs in Warsaw were closed, doesn't stop women. They were going to find nearby places like Piaseczno and Rembertov, where they had to get special train passes. And he describes how scores of women would cram into the trains with their little purses preparing to use the mikvah. They would take a pass with them, they would go on the train and come back. And at one point, he describes how there were a group of Gentiles who were standing and watching the scene, and finally when someone told them, they burst out laughing to mock the women who were so committed to this mitzvah of mikvah. Rav Shimon Huberband describes shechita and tefillah and public gatherings. It's absolutely, this is, if you're looking for information firsthand, this is not just a memoir written by someone who was there. This is written contemporaneously. It's a document that he wrote at the time, which was buried under the ghetto and only unearthed later with the documents of the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is an amazing book if you're looking for more information and more firsthand account of exactly what was going on at the time. I always find it ironically humorous that Shimon Huberband describes the first thing that the Nazis did when they rolled in with their fancy divisions was they knocked down the A-road. But guess what? He says, when we had the ghetto, all of a sudden we had the most Mahadran A-road ever. I turn your attention on the screen to another important figure in the Warsaw Ghetto, who I want to introduce to you. Let me see if I have this picture down here. Yes, you should see it in front of you. His name is Rav Clonimus Kalman Shapira. He's known as the Piasetzner Rebbe. Rav Clonimus Kalman, Zecher Tzadik Levrach Hashem Yikam Damo Zchus Yagam Aleinu. Clonimus Kalman, he was a descendant of Hasidic masters. His in-laws, his father-in-law, was a descendant of the Koshmitzer Maggid, and he had a community outside of Warsaw in a small suburb called Piasetzner. Before the war, he attracted hundreds of students to his yeshiva called Das Moshe, was the name of his father-in-law, and thousands of people. He was becoming renowned as a great Hasidic master. The Heilige Piasetzner, he was in the ghetto at the outbreak of the war. During the original bombing of Warsaw, his son was injured and several of the members of his family were killed. He went to visit his son and then left shortly thereafter, but many of the family members who remained behind were hit by a bomb. And on the second day of Sukkot, his son passed away. So just now, several weeks into the war, the Rebbe has no one, no family, no Hasidim, no students. But what does he decide to do? He decides to rebuild. What does that mean? It means gathering Jews and giving them chizur, giving them strength, direction, guidance. It's mind-blowing. The Rebbe decides he's going to sit down and write down. I didn't bring it with me today, but you can see there's a new critical edition of the Rebbe's own handwriting, the sermons he gave in the Warsaw Ghetto, which were later published by his brother after they were unearthed. We'll get to that in 1 second. The Rebbe delivered sermons on Shabbosos. He never mentioned the word Germans. He transcends the reality to address the people, to give them chizuk, hope, and talk about suffering. If you want an interesting perspective on this book, which is entitled, the original publication was Eish Kodesh, Holy Fire, take a look at The Holy Fire by Professor Nechemia Poland, an amazing analysis. So Piasetzner was there giving chizuk to Jews, and he knew Rav Shimon Yuberbein. Rav Shimon Yuberbein describes how the Piasetzner Rebbe went to the mikvah in darkness, Erev Yom Kippur. They had arranged to pay a driver to take them by car, but the driver never showed. So they had to walk, risk their life just so the Rebbe can immerse himself with the Tahara for Yom Kippur, for that special quality. Because they knew each other, it's very likely, although we can't say for sure, that the Rebbe took these documents that he hand wrote, the sermons that he wrote down, plus his diary and a few other writings, and he gave them to Rav Shimon Yuberbein, who buried them along with the Ordik Shabbos archive. So years after the war, a Polish construction worker unearths the writings of the Piasetzner Rebbe, and that's what we have today. The new critical edition by Daniel Reiser, Professor Danny Reiser, is called Drashos Mishnos Hazam, Sermons from the Years of Wrath. You can take those drashos and put them together. You can still get today a copy of Emanuel Ringelblum's diary of what's going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, or Chaim Kaplan, Hashem Yikom Damo, another diary of the Warsaw Ghetto. You can put in the dates. Go on HebrewCal.com, put in the dates, and you can figure out exactly when the Rebbe was giving drasha and what was going on in the context. I'll introduce you to one more person. Take a look on the screen, and you're going to meet one of the most warm, brilliant geniuses of pre-war Europe, the great Gaon, the Tzaddik Rav Menachem Zemba. Although he was, I guess you would say, Lithuanian educated in terms of his Torah learning, his heart and soul came from, he was orphaned at a young age from the Ger Hasidim who raised him in Warsaw. He only took upon himself a position after his father-in-law passed away and the business failed. Rav Menachem Zemba was a force in the Warsaw Ghetto. Take a look at this volume, which is coming back on the screen now. This is the diary of the Warsaw Ghetto, published, called Yoman Beghetto Barsha, published by Hillel Seidman. Dr. Hillel Seidman was a scholar and an Orthodox thinker who was living in the Warsaw Ghetto, who chronicled what was going on day by day, and also introduces us in the back of his volume to what he calls personalities, people I met in the ghetto. And he introduces you, we could spend many, many hours just analyzing and getting into the world of who these people were and what they meant, what they accomplished. It's unbelievable, superhuman. One of the men that you will meet in this diary is Rav Menachem Zemba. Dr. Hillel Seidman describes his interactions with Rav Menachem Zemba, and how Rav Menachem Zemba was the Rosh Yeshiva of sewer yeshivas, of yeshiva boys who were in Warsaw, who were learning in the sewers. And he used to go around and meet with them and test them. He describes how Menachem Zemba at one point he moved apartments. Think about it, the level of overcrowding in the ghetto. You're talking about 20 to 30 people in one apartment. And Menachem Zemba moved different places. At what point in the fall, he was in the top apartment of the 5th story of a building. Well, you know what he did? He took an axe, someone got it, and he smashed a hole in the roof to make a sukkah. And hundreds of Jews filed through Rav Menachem Zemba's apartment just so that they could be in the shade of his sukkah. He had 10,000 pages. You could just imagine what 10,000 pages of handwritten Chidushei Torah writings that were published on the Rambam and the Talmud Yerushalmi. But unfortunately, it was all lost. He remained in the ghetto. He was gunned down on Shabbos Chol Hamoed Pesach of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. The Piasek Rebbe also did not survive the war, although he did survive the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He was taken to a work camp called Twarniki, and he was killed in November of 1943. It's not just in Warsaw, in tons of different ghettos. I turn your attention to the next slide, the picture of a very interesting person who I'm Makar Tov. I thank the Spurs Library here in Chicago for getting me access to this diary of the man who you see in front of me, but Zelig Kalmanovich. Zelig Kalmanovich did not actually grow up as an Orthodox young man in Vilna. He was very involved in YIVO, in the Jewish archives of Eastern Europe, which still, by the way, exists today, which are headquartered in New York. And they had hundreds of thousands of documents tracing the history of Eastern European Jews. Zelig Kalmanovich becomes observant, and he writes a diary. He writes a diary of life in the ghetto. You could take this diary and put it up against another diary that we have by a man of, we call him in English, Herman Kruk, K-R-U-K, who documents also life in the Vilna ghetto. So here you have Zelig Kalmanovich, the religious man, and Herman Kruk, the secular man. Herman Kruk writes a diary entry about how he's going to an event to remember the founding of the Bund. But that same night, same journal entry, Herman Kruk was somewhere else. He's referenced in Zelig Kalmanovich's diary at the Simchas Torah days. Even in the ghetto, Jews found ways, not everyone, but Jews found ways to dance even on Simchas Torah. We danced, said Zelig Kalmanovich, with the Ribono Shel Olam, with the Torah, in life and in death. In Vilna, in the ghetto, there is an amazing personality. We don't have any pictures of her. We only have a testimony from a survivor. Her name was Fagel Demrov, because it wasn't just men who were resisting spiritually, who were connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who were devoted to Yiddishkeit and being led by great rabbinic luminaries. There were also women leaders. Fagel Demrov, Fagel the Rav's daughter, a woman in the Vilna ghetto who organized a group of Beis Yaakov type of girls who all of a sudden now had an entire spiritual movement in the ghetto. They had shiurim, they had tehillim groups, they had lectures, they had decorated, it describes, they had a decorated cafeteria with slogans and spiritual resistance. There were great rabbinic luminaries, there were great Nashim Tzitanios, but it reflects the character and the kinds of people and things that were going on. Average, ordinary people. If you go to the Lodz ghetto, there's a document, a chronicle that was written contemporaneously of a description of the Lodz ghetto. It's unbelievable to imagine that in the Lodz ghetto, they had not just 1 million, they had dozens, tons of minyanim. That's going to be a little bit rickety because the floor here is rickety as we're walking through. We're passing by different models of ghettos. The Lodz ghetto, they had the minyan of the Aguda and the Mizrahi and the shoemakers minyan. They had special, excuse me for saying it, they had special protocols of what to do with talesim that belonged to people who had been deported. We have in Yad Vashem an artifact, a description of what was like, what it was being said at tefillah for those who had been deported. These were commitments that Jews were making even in the ghetto. We move out of the ghetto now to a different section of the museum. What we're going to call Life in the East, where you see photographs on the side, but soon this was going to come to an end. Because before there were death camps, the Germans began their policy of mass extermination just with bullets. Just with bullets. And that's actually referenced in the name of this volume called The Holocaust by Bullets, which is an extraordinary work by a French pastor. I had the privilege of meeting Patrick Dubois, an amazing story about how he is going from town to town, village to village, to find unmarked mass graves. Because what the Germans did is they set up Einsatzgruppen, and you'll see here in the back, I'm blocking a photograph behind me, which you don't see, of women who are being prepared for execution, Rahman al-Islam. They had 4 groups, and they spread out across Eastern Europe, A, B, C, and D, to massacre one Jew at a time, one bullet at a time. There are many descriptions of these massacres. If you take a look on your screen, you have an opportunity to meet a very important Rav, but also a religious, so to speak, spiritual chronicler of life in the Shoah. His name is Rav Ephraim Oshry. If you see, there's a picture on the screen of him standing shortly after the liberation with a group of men wearing his talis, a memorial for Jews who were killed at the 7th Fort outside of Kovno. You see later a picture of him much later in life. We look back now here live. This is a copy of Rav Oshry's Sefer, Shalos and Shuvas Mimamakim, from the depths. Rav Oshry was a rabbi in Kovno, which is a suburb of Vilna in Lithuania, at the outbreak of the war. And he describes here some of the hair-raising, awesome, Oyo Benora questions the Jews asked. But in the beginning, in the Hakdama, he describes the massacre of the Jews, not just by Germans, but of the local auxiliaries. Some of them were coerced, as you'll find in the Holocaust by bullets, but many of them were interesting. Many of the local fascists or Lithuanians, anti-Semites across Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania were more than happy to participate in the slaughter. He describes the gruesome detail of putting someone's head on a Gemara and cutting it off with a saw. It's difficult to describe and to think about, but at the same time, Rav Oshry reflects on the incredible heroism and the commitment of people. So this set of chuvas is a collection of questions that people asked him. Here's an amazing question that Rav Oshry reflects on. Many of the Jews who were in the ghetto were forced into labor battalions, to slave labor. They were taken out in the morning and brought back at night. There were some Jews who were so unbelievably motivated, they were so inspired that they even risked their life to observe whatever elements of Yiddishkeit they could practically, such as wearing tefillin. So there was a man who, under the cover of darkness in the morning, would put on his tefillin while marching on the way out. As you know, you can't put on your tefillin at night, so you have to wait until it started to get light. As early as possible, he put on his tefillin, took it off. And he wasn't the only one. Some of you are familiar with one of my rabbeim, Rav Moshe Weinberger Shlita, who has a pair of tefillin from his father that he wore during the war. There are other such stories about the connection that people had to their tefillin, if they could possibly imagine such a thing. On the one hand, it's impossible. On the other hand, it happened. So this man says to Rav Oshry, I have a shayla for you. What do I do? What's the shayla? He said he was caught. He was caught wearing the tefillin. On the one hand, he was spared being killed, but he was beaten horribly and tortured. And then the Nazis, Yimach Shema V'Zichram, took a knife and engraved a cross into his bicep, which is the place where we place our tefillin. And the man comes to Rav Oshry and has a shayla. What's his shayla? The shayla is, he wants to continue to wear tefillin, but he's so humiliated by this cross, by this symbol. Can he put the tefillin on top of the shirt that he's wearing? We know that the tefillin has to be on the person. Does that constitute a chatzitza, an interruption? Could you imagine? After everything that happened to this person, the commitment to come back to want to wear tefillin again, that level, it's unbelievable. And there are countless stories of commitment that are told by Rav Oshry in this book. Rav Oshry also was in that same environment with another Rav who you'll see on the screen right now. You take a look, you could see Coming up now is Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Hashem Yikam Damas Chassidei Lane. Rabbi Chanan was one of the greatest rabbinic luminaries of pre-war Europe. He was murdered not far away from Kovno in the 9th fort in another giant mass grave. Rabbi Chanan was taken away, and he told his Talmidim as he was going away, and this is documented in the back of one of Rabbi Chanan's Sfarim called Kudras Ha'aros. There's a biographical sketch in the back where he told everybody to have kavana, to have intent to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, to be the equivalent of a sacrifice. Rabbi Chanan was one of many rabbinic luminaries, because as you know, there was a strong concentration of yeshivas in Eastern Europe, and specifically in Vilna. Not just that, at the outbreak of the war, the greatest rabbinic luminary of the time, in 1939, he dies a year later before the Germans arrived. The Germans don't arrive in the East until they get in the spring of 1941, when they broke their truce with Russia and invade the Soviet Union. But the greatest Gaon at the outbreak of the war in 1939 was Rav Chaim Ozer Grozensky, the author of the Achiezer in Vilna, the greatest Gaon in the world. After the death of the Chafetz Chaim, when he passed away in 1933, everyone looked to Rav Chaim Ozer. Rav Chaim Ozer actually invited and collected all the yeshiva bachrim who were in that Russian zone at the outbreak of the war, over 2,000. So on the one hand, you think, wow, it's a lot of boys to feed and house and clothe and take care of. On the other hand, that's all there was in Eastern Europe at that time. Such a small fragment, the entire yeshiva world. One of the great luminaries who was in Vilna, and then later, shortly outside of Vilna, in that vicinity of Vilna and Kovno, was Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. One more figure I'll introduce you to. Take a look on the next page. You know what, let's hold off on that for 1 minute. Let's just come through before we get to the next page. This section of the museum, we're not going to look at this video because this is a section which is devoted to the mass graves. But if we take a step back for a second and realize what it meant to have the loss of these individual kihilos. Some of them have been there. Yafa Eliyahu mentioned earlier, she has a book. It chronicles the history of her shtetl over 900 years. 900 years. And it was wiped out. Completely wiped out. And you think of community after community in these different areas, whether it was in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, the Einsatzgruppen, one at a time, bullet by bullet, were destroying and erasing Yiddishkeit, taking out these men, women, and children and murdering them one at a time. We think of them now as we approach this period, the 9 days, and we reflect on so many massacres over time. We also think of them on Shabbos when we have a memorial prayer. This memorial prayer in Ashkenazi communities is called Avarachim, where we remember communities that were destroyed. Originally, this prayer was created to memorialize the victims of the Crusades. Kehilos HaKodesh, Speyer, Mainz, Speyer, Worms, Magenza. But now that Avarachim prayer takes on a new meaning. One of the things that we've had the opportunity over the years to come together in different ways is to take a moment and just process. But you can't really process because the magnitude is overwhelming. But some of you've had the opportunity to be at Yad Vashem in Yerushalayim or HaKodesh. You go to the Valley of the Communities and you look along the wall and the names of these different places. The place where my family comes from, my father's family, from a small Galicianische shtetl called Barnov. There are zichronos, there are books, memory books for so many of these places. I'll share with you one old niggun, because we just take a pause for a moment to remember these communities that were wiped out instantly when the Germans showed up. We say to our Father in heaven, we say, remember them. pious, straight, the erlich, plain, pious, heartfelt servants of God. Shemosru nafsho Ushas Hashem Yizkirem O Yizkirem O Elokeinu letoivo O Yizkirem O Yizkirem Im Shear Tzadikei Oilo. Remember them among all the righteous. Yizkirem, oh Yizkirem, oh Elokeinu letoivo, oh Yizkirem, oh Yizkirem, Im Shear Tzadikei Oilo. We move out of the valley of death. You know, on the side here, many of you have traveled to Eastern Europe. You see Babi Yar and other major massacres that took place in Lithuania. What's interesting is that Father Dubois has uncovered even more massacres with greater numbers by using the incredible ingenious method, a metal detector, to find the bullets. This section of the museum teaches about the Wannsee Conference and the plan of the Germans to systematically annihilate the Jews and to take it to the next level beyond just annihilating us, killing us one bullet at a time, one community at a time, and coming up with the final solution. Originally it was gas fans, and then it became, as we know, death centers, killing centers, what we call death camps, which are separate and distinct from concentration camps or transit camps. And yet, all over Europe, Jews are now caught in this vice grip of what to do. So there were many different efforts across different communities of rescue, but also of resistance. Resistance took place spiritually, as we saw. It took place physically, as we'll see a little bit later in the museum. But also the elements of rescue were ongoing in various ways. I introduced you, take a look at the page, Rav Mechel Ber Weissman. Rav Mechel Ber Weissman was the son-in-law and the close Talmud of the Nitra Rav. He wrote a book called Mina Meitzar, which is an incredible description of how he was active together with the Nitra Rav and others. I'll bring you back here to take a look in getting the word out about what was going on, because by 1942, 1943, the word had worked Switzerland. They were trying to let the West know. Copies of telegrams here in the book, letters, active attempts. This is an original early description of what Auschwitz looked like that was sent out, trying to get the word out to the free world. But also, he was active together with the Nitra Rav in rescue efforts, specifically in Slovakia, trying to bribe officials to save Jews. Rav Mechel Ber Weissman worked with men and women, secular, Zionists, anybody who he could work with across the Jewish spectrum to try to save and ransom Jews from local officials. And there were many cases, not a ton, but there were many cases of success. I introduced you to the next figure on your screen, who were very important work in our understanding now of the role of the state of Israel, the land of Israel, Medinat Israel, of Eretz Israel. His name is Rav Teichtal. Rav Teichtal was a Hungarian Rosh Yeshiva and the author of the Tshuva Sefer called Mishnah Sacher, is a very, very prominent Rav, who was, in the spirit of many Hungarian, like Munkach and Satmar before the war, many Hungarian Hasidas, anti-Zionist. Comes toward the middle of the war, and he changes his mind. He has a total about face, and he writes a new sefer called Im Habanim Smecha. Rav Teichtal describes in Ima Banim Snecha the importance of going to Israel, the centrality of Israel, how it was a mistake to oppose moving to the land of Israel. It's a very, very interesting work, and it took a tremendous amount of courage for him to change his perspective. It's a whole interesting story in and of itself. But why is the book called Aim Habanim Smecha? The mother of the children is happy. Why is that? He writes the introduction. He says, imagine the following story, which he knows to be true, because he was living and publishing this in 1942 in Budapest. He says, you have a family. It's a mother and a father and two daughters. And they're living in Hungary, and they decide that the father is going to try to escape with the daughters over the border and run. Meanwhile, it's in springtime. They're going to try to climb over the mountains, but they get caught by the Gestapo or the Hungarian police, I forget which it was, and they are incarcerated. The mother is sitting at home. Now she's totally bereft. She's absolutely, completely shattered and broken. Her husband, her daughters, her entire life. But word gets out to someone, turns out this someone is the Nitra Rav, the one who worked for Michael Ber Weissman. There's so many of these stories, and rabbis and individuals are intertwined. The Nitra Rav succeeds in raising some money from this one to pay off that one, to bribe that one. And on Chol Hamoed Pesach, there's a knock on the door of this woman. The door opens, she opens the door, and who's there? Her husband and her two daughters. We can't imagine what that joy is like. We can't even grasp that level of emotion. Aim Habarim Smecha, the mother of the children of the family is happy. Says Rav Teitel, that's the name of the book. Because when Israel, the land of Israel, welcomes back its children, that's how happy HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. That's how happy the land is. The land is very oftentimes compared to our mother, Eretz Yisrael, as unfortunately, Rav Teitel, although he wrote this book and published it during the war, he did not survive. We continue now moving through. Jews are rounded up in their different communities and their neighborhoods, and they're deported. I'm going to go down past this next section where we're going to pass around the corner, as you see. We're describing here the final solution deportation to foreign centers. On the wall, back, those who had the opportunity to come and visit the museum in person, and I mentioned that it's open now. The description and listen to the survivors describe of being deported. They go up and stand in to give you a little bit of sense. Oh, okay. This is a rail car. This rail car, as you can see here, is about 6 feet tall. It's maybe about 7 feet tall. It's about 10 feet width. See how many, I don't know, hard to gauge exactly how long it is, maybe about 20 feet wide. This rail car is an actual rail car. It's not a rail car which carry Jews, although if you're interested, there are, for example, in Yad Vashem, there are some rail cars. Yad Vashem has one, and there are others. The Detroit Holocaust Museum used to have a rail car that carried Jews, and now actually pieces of wood are being made into Jewish artifacts. For those who are interested, there's a survivor named Martin Lowenberg who can make you a mezuzah with the wood from a cattle car. It's an amazing thing. But this is the type of cattle car that would carry Jews, and what it meant for people to lose their dignity. In this tiny space, you would have between 80 and 100 people packed in on top of each other. Men, women, children, no bathroom, just a corner, a bowl. People, the halacha, we demonstrate the importance of kavod habrios by violating many laws in the Torah. The Gemara says in Brachos that we suspend many rules and halakhic regulations because of kavod habrios, because of personal dignity. the first thing that was ripped away from people was their dignity. They had just a small package, and they're in this cattle car with no privacy, no place to relieve themselves, no air, no food, multiple days traveling on end until where did they get? They were being resettled in the east. So if we follow here, we're going to go down the ramp. You see a picture here on the wall of people who are arriving in these death centers. The Germans established in Poland 6 killing centers, 6 death camps. See in front of you, there's a sign for Belzec. Aktion Reinhard, which was the code name for the murder of the Jews in German-occupied Poland, was going to be carried out by the establishment of these death camps. This is the uniform, which there were different demarcations of people who were political prisoners, Jews. If you look on this map over here, if you follow me, you'll see the location of these death camps. You see not far Warsaw, so many of the Jews of Warsaw, most of them ended up being killed in Treblinka. There's Sobibor, there were thousands of these types of camps throughout Germany, France, and Eastern Europe. This famous sign, Arbeit frei, work makes you free, but it doesn't make you free of anything. Jews came down out of the trains where they were being unloaded, and they found themselves completely surrounded by dogs, barbed wire, barking guards. Turn your attention to the screen for a second. You're going to meet an incredible, beautiful person and an amazing story. The man you're going to see right now, his name is Rav Moshe Chaim Lau. Rav Lau was the Rav of a community called Pietrków. Pietrków is a very prominent Polish Jewish community. There were many Sfardim that were Polish in Pietrków. Rav Lau arrives in arrives in Treblinka with his community. This story is told by his son, the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, in his book, Al Tishlach Yodcha El Anar, which has an English version. I forget what it's called. I forget the name of the English version. Rav Lau arrives in Treblinka with his community from Pietrków. But on the picture that you're looking, you see a younger Rav Lau. That picture is not taken in Pietrków, it's taken in a city called Prešov. Prešov was a Slovakian town where Rav Lau was the Rav before he became the Rav in Pietrków. So in the book, it describes the most unbelievable hashgacha that the Rebbe orchestrated. Rav Lau arrives in Treblinka with his community, with his men, women, and children from Pietrków. And at the same time, on the same day, another train is arriving from Prešov. The members of both communities spill out onto the Auschwitz grounds, and they're being selected, and Rav Lau goes with many members of both communities to the left. And he leads his new community and his old community, which had in the interim never replaced him and not established a new Rav in Shema and in Vidui. And there are countless accounts of similar ways that Jews went to their death with Shema Yisrael on their lips. In this case, it's one Rav and two communities. Take a look at the next person you're going to meet on the screen. Is the Chicago personality. His name is Rav Tzvi Hirsch Meisels. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Meisels is known as the Vice in the Rav, the author of a collection of responsa called Mekadshe Hashem, which include his own questions and answers to issues of the day, but also other Hungarian Rabbanim. Because remember, Hungary was not occupied by the Germans until 1944. Until then, it was just the anti-Semitic Hungarians. So Jewish life had more of a semblance. Most of the Hungarian Jews were not murdered until a major deportation in the summer and fall of 1944. So the Weizsäcker Rav is living and describing what's going on. An example of one of the questions that was being asked in Hungary is how to deal with Pesach. Do they have to use the same water standards that they had used? Many Hasidim are makbid to draw by hand mayim shalono, overnight water, for the baking of their matzos. What about using plain flour? What about women who want to immerse in mikvah, but there's a curfew? Can they go during the day? The amazing devotion of Hungarian Jews, so many of them pious Hasidic Jews. So the Weizsäcker Rav is deported to Auschwitz, and he arrives there just before Rosh Hashanah, 1944. This is published by the Weizsäcker Cheder, this volume called Shar Mahmadim, which is an English translation of the introduction to Makat Shashim, where Rav Meisel's, where the Weizsäcker Rav, this is an early picture you see on the screen of She'eris Yisrael, which is the school that the Weizsäcker Rav Meisel's began after the war. He describes what it was like in Auschwitz before Rosh Hashanah, 1944. And what he describes, this is his first-hand personal account. Not every account that you will find is absolutely true. There are some stories in the Holocaust that you will hear from different places that are they're not accurate, they're not verified, but one of the things with Hasidic tales, Yaf Eliach describes how she tries to verify the different stories. This is the Weizsäcker Rav's personal account. That on Rosh Hashanah, and this happened on occasion, the Weizsäcker Rav actually still had with him a shofar. And there was a group of boys. Many of these boys were his students. Many of them were his bachrim in yeshiva before the war in Hungary. 1,400 students were rounded up in Erev Rosh Hashanah, and they were brought to a specific barrack. They were put in a sealed barrack, and the Weizsäcker described how they tried to bargain and deal with getting boys out of this barrack, but they were basically sealed. And one of the boys sent a message to someone, to the Weizsäcker Rav, that they heard that he had a shofar, and that they would like him to please come. These bachrim asked that he come and blow the shofar for them on Rosh Hashanah. Could you imagine? What did they want? They wanted to hear the Tkiyah shofar. So the Weizsäcker Rav debated, is it halachically correct, halachically incorrect, risking his life, not risking his life? He decided he couldn't not do it. He goes and he travels with his son, sneaks over to that barrack, and he starts to speak to these boys. When the 1,400 boys in the isolated barrack found out that I had a shofar, they pleaded that I come to the barrack to blow the shofar for them. They wanted to have the merit of this precious mitzvah during their last moments before they were burned al Kiddush Hashem. I stood there weighing my decision. Rebbe, they cried, for Hashem's sake, have rachmanas on us and give us the merit of listening to the shofar in our final hour. My own doubts were reinforced by my son, Zalman Leib, who was with me and begged me not to put my risk at life. I decided I couldn't turn the boys down. I started haggling with the kapos, who stubbornly refused to allow me into the barracks, and finally, in exchange for a sizable sum of money that was raised, they gave in. They warned me to listen for the sound of the bell at the main gate, for that was the signal that the Nazis were coming in. He said Zalman Leib was going to stand outside. He says, even though maybe the halakha would not agree with me, I couldn't not go in there. There is not a writer or a poet in the entire world who could portray my feelings as I entered the sealed barracks. It was only due to the miracle of God that my heart did not burst in anguish when I saw before me the bitter the sea of tear-stung eyes. They pressed forward to kiss my hand, my clothing, any place they could get close to me. Rebbe, have rachmanas. Many of them I knew. I was about to blow the shofar. He says he had to go right away before the SS came, but they wouldn't let me. They said, please say something, a little drasha, a word of Torah. I lift my eyes to the mountains. The Rebbe gave them words of Torah. Chizuk. I cannot hold back the words. I must tell this. I tell the story so the future generations will know the great Mesiras Nefesh and fervently holy words that I heard from these young boys shortly before they were taken to the ovens. It's unbelievable. They said to each other, one boy says, Chaver Yedidim, the Rebbe has strengthened us. And he summarizes the drasha. We have to prepare, even though we hope for the best. Kavel Hashem, we prepare for the worst. For the sake of Hashem, let's cry out Shema Yisrael. The Weizmann says he saw this, he heard this with his own eyes. With heart-rending voices and burning passion, they cried out, Shema Yisrael. And then one boy says something even more audacious. Another boy says, we're not going to give the Rebbe Yashkoyach for his great Mesiras Nefesh for giving us the Tzkiya Shofar, but rather we're going to give you a bracha that in this merit, Hashem Yisbarach will help that the Rebbe will merit to leave this place alive and well. And all the boys answered in thundering unison, Amen. The Weizmann Rav, who lived and rebuilt his life right here in Chicago, from the depths of hell at Auschwitz. I turned your attention to the screen to meet one more man here in this valley of death, in this kingdom of night. The man's name is Reb Leib Langfus. We don't have a picture of Reb Leib Langfus, who is a dayan, a judge in the Polish community of Makov. The Makover dayan, he arrives in Auschwitz after the deportation, after their Gerush, you see in the handwriting here. To come back to the screen, you can see in this glass module here an image of the crematorium. Jews went in, they undressed, they were put in a specific room. Zyklon B was dropped in, they were asphyxiated. Then they were taken to an elevator where they were taken up to an area of the crematorium where their bodies were burned. Out the smokestack. Who did this work of the undressing, of the piling the bodies, of burning them? There's a group known as the Sonder Commando. This group of Sonder Commando lived in more, quote unquote, normal conditions, maybe you could call it. They had beds, unlike barracks. There's an amazing book called We Wept Without Tears by Gideon Greif, who went around interviewing Sonder Commando. Well, one of these Sonder Commando was none other than Reb Leib Langfus. The dayan of Makov became a Sonder Commando in Auschwitz. And we know this from several sources, one of which is that near the crematoria, Sonder Commando buried various important items, including pairs of tefillin and notes. So the screen you saw before is a picture of notes, which we don't have to look at it now. But Reb Leib Langfus wrote some notes about his experience, about the Gerush, the destruction of his community, but then also about his experience as a Sonder Commando. Not only that, there's an incredible book that analyzes some of the documents that were found buried near the crematorium. It's called the Auschwitz Scrolls, Scrolls of Auschwitz, I forget which one. In there, it was done by a scholar by the name of Bear Mark. His wife, Esther Mark, finished this work, and she was one of the people, she has figured out that this dayan, Reb Leib Langfus, authored some of the anonymous scrolls that were found around the Auschwitz crematorium. She figured that out in an ingenious way, because on the bottom of one of the papers, it was signed Aleph Lamed Reish Aleph, ALRA. And they were trying to figure out, what does Aleph Lamed Reish Aleph, what does ALRA stand for? Well, she realized something just more ingenious. Aleph Lamed Aryeh Leib Reish Aleph stands for Regel Aroch, foot long, which in Yiddish is long piece, Langfus. That was his secret way of telling us that Rabbi Aryeh Leib was writing this letter to us, to our generation, to the survival, to the future Jews. An amazing story is told by one of the Sonderkommando who worked together with Rabbi Leib Langfus, who was killed after there was an October uprising that blew up on the crematoria. The Nazis killed most of the Sonderkommando, and they would kill them periodically. Rabbi Leib Langfus was together with this group of Jews, several of them Greek Jews, which is why they got there late rather than Polish Jews who had been there for longer. This Greek Jew said to Rabbi Leib Langfus, "What do I do? I'm a Kohen. How can a Kohen who is restricted from coming in contact with a corpse, with a dead person, be handling dead bodies and burning them?" So Gideon Greif asked the survivor, "So what did Rabbi Leib Langfus tell you? What did the Makar V'Dayan tell you?" So the man said, "He told me that it's a mitzvah, and it's a form of kavura, of burial, because even Kohanim are allowed to help a mace mitzvah, somebody who has nowhere to bury them." And the man said, "It gave me strength to go on even in that time." The commitment, the fact that this Kohen, who had everything taken away from him, if you look in the third section of Yapa Eliach's Chassidic Tales, she calls the third section faith alone, because everything else had been stripped away. They had no parents, they had no children, they had no friends, they had nothing. But so many of them still held on to their Yiddishkeit, to their spark, to their human dignity, and to their God, their neshama within. There are so many, countless stories. This is the section that the museum dedicates to the death camps. Now, there is not a section here in the museum about concentration camps, but there too we could talk at great length. We'll reference one a little bit later called Bergen-Belsen, but there were thousands and thousands of concentration camps where Jews also were Moser Nefesh to continue their connection to Yiddish. The next section of the museum is actually new. It was built this past summer. And it's focused on resistance, armed resistance. Jews who stood up to fight, whether they were in the Warsaw Ghetto or other places. We mentioned earlier Rabbi Menachem Zemba, Hashem Yikam Donos Chesed Aleinu. He gave a talk on Hanukkah. Hanukkah 1942, you can imagine this has the feel of like a very confined place, like being back in the ghetto, resistance in the ghetto. Rabbi Menachem Zemba gave a talk on Hanukkah, talking about how sometimes you have to live al Kiddush Hashem, and sometimes the person may even have to die al Kiddush Hashem. And that's why he gave his rabbinic haskama, this great Rabbi Menachem Zemba, to what would become the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. There were other rabbis who were supporting active resistance, like the Radziner Rebbe. But I want to take you here into the forest and introduce you to see the next person on your screen. You see these pillars are giving you the imagination as if we were standing in the forest, joining the partisans. There were many Jews. Take a look on your screen. I want to introduce you Rabbi Yisrael Zev Gustman. Rabbi Gustman was one of the greatest rabbinic luminaries in pre-war Europe. And I know I've said that multiple times, and we've met multiple people, but we can't underscore this concept enough of what these great giants were, and how even though maybe some of them didn't survive or they passed on, but the idea of learning their Torah, mentioning their names, it should be a blessing for all of us. We're tapping into the koach of their neshamas in that world. Rav Gustman was the youngest member of the rabbinical court of the Bezdin of Rav Chaim Ozer Brzezinski. Rav Chaim Ozer, mentioned, was the greatest luminary in all of Europe before the war. And at the age of 21, Rav Gustman was on his Bezdin. Rav Yisrael Zev Gustman was in the Vilna ghetto. He was there with his wife, his little daughter, and his little son. He had a 4-year-old son, his name was Meir. And one day the Germans find him, and they take the back of their rifle, and while Rav Gustman is holding this little boy, they start to beat him with the back of the rifle until they smash his skull and he dies. Rav Gustman had to sell his own son's, 4-year-old son's shoes to buy food in the ghetto, which he wouldn't eat, but he could give to his wife and his daughter. Finally, at an opportune moment, the Baruch Hu opened the crack in the wall of the ghetto, and Rav Gustman runs out. He finds a farmer, he, his wife, and his daughter. They stay in a pit for several months. In this pit, he describes later, he learned all of the Masechtas Zvachim 50 times. But then he has to leave and he goes into the forest. If you come back to the screen, you imagine here you are in the forest,
Here's a man, one of the greatest geniuses of pre-war Europe, wandering around, and he describes later that he saw a guy, a German soldier, walking in the woods. He found him, he jumped him, and he killed him with his bare hands. Rav Guzman describes that he himself was personally the kind who fulfilled the mitzvah of destroying Amalek with his own hands. Now, there's a lot of discussion in Achronim about, is Amalek, the Amalekite nation, is that a biological phenomenon, or is that, as Rav Chaim Soloveitchik Frisker says, he says that's a basic typology of person who wants to hate the Jewish people for no reason. But that idea, that's what Guzman lived with. He joined the band of partisans because he needed to kill that German, because he needed his weapon, because most partisans would not allow you to join unless you had your own weapon. He survives the war, makes it to Israel, and sets up his yeshiva. For those who are familiar, it's like Ramban and Ibn Ezra in the Wahhabi neighborhood of Yerushalayim, Kodesh. Yeshivas Netzach Yisrael of Ramles. It's a beautiful yeshiva, it's a beautiful ground. He personally was responsible for helping with the gardening. He was doing gardening in the yeshiva. Why? Because he had a karsatov for the trees and the berries and the shrubs that he lived on and he ate while they lived in the forest until they were liberated. There's an amazing story to the Baron of Guzman that I just have to tell you to give you the perspective on who he was. On the one hand, he was a man from the previous world, from Europe, from Lita. On the other hand, he was a man who loved all Jews and appreciated the state of Israel and the people of Israel. He would stand outside his apartment and he would watch when there was an Israeli parade, or just watch the children cry. In 1982, Rav Guzman paid a Shiva visit. In his neighborhood in Rechavia, there is a distinguished Israeli professor who was a close friend of Rav Guzman, because Rav Guzman had in his yeshiva some of the most remarkable, intellectually accomplished Jews of Yerushalayim and of Israel. Some of them were rabbis, some of them were just brilliant people. They congregated around this brilliant and open-hearted man. So Rav Guzman's shiurim were attended by all kinds of people, not just yeshiva students. He paid a shiva call to one of his close talmidim. His name is Professor Robert Aumann, who now has a Nobel Prize in economics. Professor Aumann was sitting shiva for his son, who he lost in the Lebanon War in 1982. Rav Guzman comes in, and of course, Dr. Aumann was very moved that the great Rosh Hashiva Rav Guzman would come to pay him a shiva call. And Rav Guzman comes in, and he asked Dr. Aumann, "Could I please sit down next to you on the floor?" Dr. Aumann says, "For sure, come sit down." So Rav Guzman sits down to him, the two of them are sitting on the floor, and Rav Guzman looks at Dr. Aumann and he says to him, "I have to tell you that our sons are together now. Our sons are together in a minyan." And Dr. Aumann looked at him and knew that Rav Guzman had a boy who had been killed by the Germans. And Rav Guzman said to him, "You know, in Shemayim, there's a minyan of Jews. There's a special minyan, and our sons are davening in the minyan together. And you should know that your son is the chazan of our minyan, of our boys. Your son is the shliach tzibur. Because even though both of our sons were killed al Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God, but your son, he died fighting for the land and the state of Israel. And that makes him be the chazan for our children." This is Rabbi Yisrael Zev Guzman, a fighter, a resistance fighter in the forest. We're going to continue on a little bit here. The next section, this is the Bielski. All right, I'll tell you one more quick story. I know it's getting late, but we're getting short on time. But the Bielski brothers, several years ago, I'll tell you one amazing milestone. Several years ago, the Kolo, through our MCGL efforts, we did a Yom HaShoah program where we brought the last remaining Bielski brothers, and it's Aaron Bielski, who was the youngest of the four brothers who led a group of over 1,000 Jews who were ultimately liberated, who survived the war. And the Bielski brothers did not require that you needed to have a gun to join their partisan group. So we had this event where we brought Aaron Bell, who was going to speak, and was up in Northbrook in Darfur Noah. We were sitting, I was interviewing him. He was sitting on the stage, and there were, rather about 70, 80 people in the audience. And after he spoke about his experience as a young boy, as part of the partisans, as a member of the Bielski brothers, An older woman, short, stocky woman with white hair, short white hair, raised her hand and started speaking, and I didn't understand what she was saying. She was speaking in Russian, and she kept going on 10 seconds, 20, 30, 40, 50 seconds, and then she just sat down. And we all sat there looking around, we didn't know what to make of this. Finally, about a few seconds later, after the awkward silence, another man gets up and says, I know Russian, I'm going to translate what she just said. This woman says that she and her mother were in the Novgorod ghetto, and that her mother tunneled out with her with a couple of other Jews and ran to the forest and joined the Bielski brothers. And she said, I just want to thank you, because if it wouldn't be for you, I would not be alive and here today. I saw this with my own eyes, and everybody just clapped. It was an amazing one. So we're going to move now out of the resistance section to the section where they focus on the world response. Now, I had the opportunity years ago to visit Hyde Park, not Hyde Park, the neighborhood in Chicago, but Hyde Park in New York, where there is a presidential museum, which is dedicated, and also has the cover of FDR. It was interesting to me that even though it is a shrine to FDR, nonetheless, there is one little note in the exhibit which notes that there was a great controversy about whether or not FDR did enough to rescue, to support Jews. The Jewish community, however, banded together. We don't have time to talk now about the Vada HaHatzalah and the efforts of Jews to raise funds across the world to support and help trapped European Jews, but specifically to focus on the Sheiros, the remnant of Torah leadership. And so some of you are familiar. If you look on the next screen, you're going to see an artifact, which is here on the wall, an artifact and a picture of a woman who some of you know from our community. The artifact is the transit papers, which you can see close in on the screen, which I'll show you on the wall. Take a look now on the wall. This little girl who you see in your picture, this is Rebbetzin Esther Levin. Her husband, Rabbi Avram Chaim Levin, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Tel Yeshiva here in Chicago, was an incredible source of support and chizuk and inspiration for me personally and for our kollel and for the entire community. So a few weeks ago on Yom HaShoah, we had the opportunity to interview Rebbetzin Levin. And we put this document on the screen because this is the travel papers from her family. This is her father, Rav Mordechai Ginsburg, who is a great Talmud Chacham and a mere Talmud. He was a personal student of the Brisker Rav from Yitzchak Zev Levi Soloveitchik, and she described that when they ran away from Europe, when they had papers to go through Shanghai, he had a little suitcase which included his notes of the lectures that he heard at the feet of his teacher, his Rebbe, Rav Yitzchak Zev Levi Soloveitchik, which we have now published today. That Masorah, that tradition that we started back with, to the great rabbis before the war, and went to individual people. She's crying, I guess she's not so happy over here. Her father went with them with her grandfather. They traveled through Shanghai, and many of these Mir Yeshiva students owe their life to the support of a network of Jews around the world, and to Sugihara, who was the Japanese consul, who enabled them to get visas to get out of there. Among many others, like Wallenberg, and some of you are familiar. As we move away from the camps toward the end of the war, I want to turn your attention to another figure on the screen to meet. Take a look. As the war is winding down, there are still camps that are being either liquidated, the Germans are killing the members of the camps, or they're being sent on death marches. I want to introduce you now to Rav Aaron Yisachar Davids. Rav Aaron Yisachar Davids was the chief rabbi of Rotterdam. He was one of more than 10 rabbis from the Netherlands who were first sent to a transit camp called Westerbork, and then to either Bergen-Belsen or Auschwitz. Rav Aaron Yisachar Davids and a group of other Dutch Jews find themselves in Bergen-Belsen, and even though he died for the liberation,
There is in his family a tradition, this is published in Rabbi Motz Haggadah and it's elsewhere, this most unbelievable document, which if you can see on the screen is a prayer, it's a tefillah. It was written by Rabbi Arnie Sacher Davids and other rabbis in Bergen-Belsen, Pesach, before they were killed. And it's a tefillah, it's a plea for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to accept their mitzvah. What was their mitzvah? Eating chametz on Pesach. Because we know that Jewish law supersedes, except for several rare exceptions, cardinal sins, even eating chametz on Pesach is permitted in case of pikuach nefesh, of a life-saving circumstance. The Jews of Bergen-Belsen, these Dutch Jews and others, they were so committed, even at the end of the war, even after everything that they had suffered, even though they couldn't observe the mitzvah of eating matzah, but they could observe not to violate the laws of Hashem and to fulfill the will of God by eating chametz. And that's what you see on your screen, this incredible prayer. This Yehi Ratzon, that God should accept their eating on Pesach as a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Mishmartim Oven Satan. If you look back here, I'm sharing with you a book. This picture of Rabbi Arnie Sacher Davids. Can't see? Okay. Let's keep going. You can't see it, but I have in here a volume the Eila Eskara. This is a 7-volume encyclopedia of great rabbinic Torah personalities whose lives were cut short. And each one at the beginning, there are about seven volumes. Each one, just if you can see now? You can't see. Hold on one second. Let's pause this. We'll pause for 1 second. Okay, we're going to turn it around now so that you can follow me. Hope you can see me now. Yeah. Great. Hold on. Hold on 1 second. Okay, just setting up the other direction now. Okay, so here you are. You can see this is the volume of the Eila Eskara. And these are the photographs of the different Rabbanim alphabetically organized. We don't have time to focus on them today. I'm going to turn your attention now to this section of the museum on liberation. I'll share with you one more story from Rav Lau. Rav Lau was liberated. You see here pictures of GIs. I don't know if you can see it in the background here, liberating Jews. You know, it's an opportunity to acknowledge the many American service members who were from the Jewish community and from the religious community. My paternal grandfather, one of them, who served in the American Army and were active in fighting the Germans during World War II. So Rav Lau, Rav Yisrael Meir Lau, was an 8-year-old boy together with Elie Wiesel and Rav Menashe Klein. They were liberated in Buchenwald. Rav Lau was 8 years old and he meets there one of the American service members. His name is Rabbi Herschel Schachter, Zichrono Livracha. Rabbi Schachter was a prominent American rabbi, and he was a chaplain in the American Army. And Rabbi Lau, who was 8 years old, his nickname was Lulik. He looks at this Rabbi Schachter. Rabbi Schachter looks down at him and he says, "How old are you? How old are you?" So Rabbi Lau says to him, "Older than you are." "What do you mean?" Says Rabbi Lau, "Because you're crying and I don't cry anymore." After the liberation, we meet a very special Hasidic master who was not only a giant during the war, but after the war played a crucial role. I'm going to I'm going to take you now to see. Let me see. Hold on. Here we go. The Kloisenberger Rebbe, Rev Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam. Those who can see it. The Kloisenberger survived the war. This is a picture of him right after the war. I'm going to show you a picture. This is a picture of the Rebbe much later. The Kloisenberger survives the war after a period of time in Auschwitz and in the Moldor forest, a death march indescribable. What the Rebbe describes here is the biography here. It's impossible, but it happened. To imagine that the Rebbe never ate non-kosher food, but he never even ate bishul akum, food that was cooked by a non-Jew that would be forbidden by halacha. It's absolutely incredible. The Rebbe, during the entire war, was makbid on connecting to the Ribono Shel Olam, even though his wife and 10 children were murdered right when they were taken from Hungary to Auschwitz. And he had one last son. His 11th child died at the end of the war, but it didn't matter because even at the end of the war, he continued to maintain his devotion to Yiddishkeit and to strengthen others. So there are many descriptions here in this book of what the Rebbe did during the post-war years in serving the community. He was in a place, in a DP camp called Feldafing. There's actually video that you can get online of the visit that Dwight Eisenhower paid to Feldafing and how there's an interaction which is cataloged in this book and another interesting book called Lieutenant Birnbaum of the interaction between the Rebbe and Eisenhower. Eisenhower didn't speak Yiddish, but Meyer Birnbaum did, and Meyer Birnbaum was translating for the Supreme Allied Commander what the Rebbe was saying in Yiddish. But the night before, that was on Yom Kippur, on September 10th, 1945, the night before, the Rebbe was so weak and so broken, but he davened Kol Nidre with a group of survivors. Here's more pictures of the Rebbe. And it describes that the Rebbe got up to speak on Kol Nidre night. After Kol Nidre, he had a few words. He opened up the machzor and he said to the people, Ashamnu? He asked, Ashamnu, did we sin? Bagadnu? Did we rebel? Gazalnu? Did we steal? Was any of this written for us? Did anybody here have a chance to sin? Did anybody here have a chance to steal? And he says parenthetically, he says, the truth is, I did steal. I have to admit that once I rolled over at night in the barrack and a piece of my skin was pinched in between the boards and I started to bleed and I moaned and I woke up the man next to me. So I stole his sleep. But did anyone else sin? Did anyone else steal? Dibaru Dofi, did anyone say Lashon Hara? Did anyone have idle speech? And he went through each one of the Ashamnus, and to the shocked crowd, he closed the machzor. He says, this is not for us. It's not for us. He says, but maybe we did sin. Maybe we need our own al-khayt. And if it hadn't been the Rebbe, and if it hadn't been at that time, who would have the audacity to say this? No one. No one. The temerity. To say that maybe we lacked in our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in wishing that we would die and rather not live another day. That's what we need to beat our chests for this Yom Kippur. This was the strength, the moral fiber, the commitment, the superhuman commitment of a man who had lost his wife and 11 children, had nothing but the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's what he got to work doing. Many of you are familiar with the great Gaon today, Rav Asher Weiss, Shalita. Rav Asher Weiss, his father was a close confidant of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. He was with him at Auschwitz and afterwards and during the liberation and how he rebuilt. His father came to the Rebbe after the war and the Rebbe said, we have to deal with certain issues. And the man said, Rav Asher Weiss's father, said, Rebbe, but didn't we do enough for the Jews? Now we have to deal with arranging burials and grave markers. And all. The Rebbe said, that was Mesiras Nefesh. Now it's Mesiras Hakuf. the Rebbe gave everything for the Jewish people, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He rebuilt his Hasidus in Williamsburg, and then in the Tanya, there's Tzan's Klausenberg Hasidus. Some of you are familiar with the Laniado Hospital that was built by the Rebbe himself. So now as we move on to the final section of the museum, Seeking Justice, the next section is focused on the Nuremberg trials, which are captured here in a photograph behind me. And then the main conclusion of the exhibit, which we're going to focus on now, is the rebuilding. I'm going to turn your attention on the screen to the next slide here, focusing on rebuilding. Where did they rebuild? Where did the Jews and specifically the Torah community rebuild? Well, both in Israel and in America. In Israel, some of you are familiar with this great Gaon, Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, the Panovizh Rav. The Panovizh Rav survives, comes to Israel, finds a hill in Bnei Brak, and he says, I'm going to rebuild. The people said to him, Rabbi, you're dreaming. He said, yes, I'm dreaming. But most people, they dream with their eyes closed, and I dream with my eyes open. In America, Rav Aaron Kotler, and this picture is a fascinating photograph because Rav Aaron Kotler is on the right side as a younger man, and on the left side is Rav Elchanan Wasserman. On the left, we mentioned Rav Elchanan Hashem Yikom Damo. Rav Aaron Kotler miraculously arrives in America in 1941, escapes the war, and he's going to rebuild in America. Here we have the rebuilding of the American Torah community, which was his life's work, and he establishes the Beis Medrash Gavoa in Lakewood, in New Jersey, which now has thousands and thousands of Talmidim. So the idea of rebuilding takes place not just in the lives of survivors individually, but also on a macro level in terms of the world of Torah. So here you have pictures on the various life cycle occasions of people, marriages. If you come in person, you could see Sifrei Torah, the new home in the United States. And then finally, getting to the modern section of the museum, where they talk about anti-Semitism and hate, and they remember, here is an opportunity to remember the 1970s right here, the neo-Nazi march, which is part of the reason that this museum was built in Skokie, is because A, Skokie has a very high concentration, even internationally, of Holocaust survivors, and B, this was the place of the neo-Nazi march, which is part of the reason that they marched here. So when we close this loop and we finish the museum, when we head out to this section here, there's actually a little theater where there's a video. Usually you can go through this side to see the theater. It's a Shem when everybody's back together, you'll be able to see it. There's a section here on the capture of Eichmann, which is very fascinating, more than what we're going to talk about today. But I just want to conclude with two thoughts. We're going to slide here to the end of the museum. Here, by the way, is several pictures. Some of these people I've had the opportunity to meet personally. Some of them, when you come to the museum, you'll be able to meet them. And some of them have gone to the other world. Important survivors from our community. When you see someone like that, how beautiful it is. One of the great privileges we had when we came to Chicago is that I had the chance to go to get my haircut. And even if I wasn't getting my haircut, just to go there, Benny the barber, who was a barber first in Plunsk, which is the Polish town where Ben Gurion was from, and then in Auschwitz for 3 years, to have him cut my hair with his tattoo on his arm and just give me a bracha to bring my children there. If you know a survivor, if you have someone in your family, to embrace them, to connect with them. How do we process all of this? So obviously, it's a lot to take in. And we've journeyed through the Holocaust from the beginning, thinking about different perspectives from the lay leaders, regular common man, to the great Gaonim, the Rabbanim, whose Torah we still learn. But the question is, how do we start to digest it and process it? So one of the things that as a Kola we've done is we've worked with different groups in schools, for example. And sometimes we'll ask students, what do you think about schar va'onesh? reward and punishment as a way of relating to the Holocaust. And for some students, for some people, that works. Whether it's that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was meting out a punishment for something of, too much Zionism, not enough Zionism, different cheshbonos. For me, that personally doesn't resonate. How would I know? You have to be an accountant of your Ribono Shel Olam. So one of the people who has talked a lot about the Holocaust, was an important voice to be heard here, is this man who's on your screen, Rav Yehuda Amital. Rav Amital was a Romanian Holocaust survivor who came to Israel after surviving in a labor camp. Rav Amital was interviewed toward the end of his life in this magazine. It's very interesting. It's a secular Jewish magazine where Rav Amital was interviewed about his experience in the Holocaust. And he says, when it comes to the Holocaust, when it comes to the Shoah, Ani omeid bifnei kir. I stand before a wall. I have questions and I don't have answers. But the fact that I have questions doesn't diminish my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He can still, Rav Amital, as those students of Yeshivat Har Etzion will likely remember from years before, Rav Amital was the Chazan. The Chazan, not just during Shabbos and Yom Tovim, but on Yom Noraim. Here's the picture for Rav Amital from this last interview. When it comes to the Shoah, I stand before a wall. I have questions, I don't have answers. He says, I met Abba Kovner. Abba Kovner was a famous intellectual and leader in the Lithuanian Jewish community in Vilna. Abba Kovner, he said, Rav Amital, he said, was not religious. So I said to Abba Kovner after the war, so which one of us is better off? You believed in man, and I believed in God. Do you have answers to your questions? When I believed in God before the war, I had a lot of questions also. I had questions then, I have questions now. But the questions don't take away from my ability to have emunah. That's one important perspective. Questions, living with questions, validating questions. That's what Tisha B'Av is about. Eicha, how could it be? On the one hand, yes, mibnei chata'inu, we did things. On the other hand, how could it be? Living with emunah with questions. That's part of life. With questions, we still have emunah. But then there's one more perspective that we can share, and with this we'll close. The man who is now on your screen, let's see if you can see it, Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, he arrives in America in the 1930s. He is from the rabbinic dynasty of the Brisker tradition, one of the greatest luminaries of the Torah community. Whoops, hold on. Here we go. Rav Soloveitchik is living in Boston, giving shiurim in YU. He actually remarked that sometimes the greatest prayers of HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned down from a position in Eastern Europe, in a prominent town, to become the Rav. Because he was rejected from that, the Ribono Shel Olam brought him to America. After the Holocaust, he delivered a fundamental and basic talk thinking about the Holocaust and about the state of Israel. And it's called Kol Dodi Dofek. The voice of my beloved is knocking. My beloved is knocking. The knocking, that portion of the talk is related to the founding of the state of Israel. But the first portion is about the Holocaust. He talks about fate and destiny, about different concepts in the Jewish world and our Jewish identity. But within that, he makes a crucial distinction. And with this, we conclude this experience and our perspective. There's a difference, he says, between why and what. We ask why. On Tisha B'Av, we're going to ask why. But does anyone have a good answer for that? Unless you're a prophet, do you know why? Going down the rabbit hole of why is not a very rewarding path. I had the opportunity of spending a lot of time toward the end of the life of someone who I knew in the neighborhood who was diagnosed with a serious illness. And at the beginning, when I would meet with this person, it was amazing, it was beautiful. I don't know anything, I don't know what to tell him. I just wanted to be there to give him some chizuk, to be with him. And he would ask why. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu give them this illness? Why did this happen to him? Why? But then after several months, he stopped asking why. He asked a different question. What? What do I do now? What does God expect of me? What opportunities do I have now that I have this situation? The Neshama should have an aliyah, he should rest in peace. He didn't survive that year. But that movement from why to what is crucial. Rav Soloveitchik says the key question that we should be asking ourselves is what? That's what the halacha says we focus on as a mourner. What does a mourner do? What does a Jewish person do in the face of monstrous, gruesome destruction and suffering? What? What now? Each of us, in reflecting on this experience, we need to ask ourselves, what do we do? Do we spend more time to find a survivor in our community? Do we hug our children? Do we phone a neighbor? Do we learn a sefer from someone whose ashes are scattered over Europe? Do we read more history of our people? Do we connect in a deeper way? Do we say Tehillim? What can we do to continue this tradition? We started at the beginning and we pointed out how before the war, there was a mimetic tradition, and that was broken by the Holocaust. But can we create that mimetic tradition for our children? There were so many pious Jews, simple folk who had an awareness of God, had an amazing emunah. Can we create that for ourselves? And we talked about the fact that there were great rabbinic luminaries, many of whom we met on this journey today. Can we learn their Torah? Can we follow their lead? Can we live up to the standards of Yiddishkeit that they set for us? The question is not why. It's a valid question, but I can't answer that question, and I don't know anyone who can. The question is what? What do we do now? And what we do enables us to move forward, to build the Yiddishkeit that we want for ourselves, for our children, for our community, to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a more deep way, to realize the incredible Masorah that has been bequeathed to us, the tradition that we have, and the spiritual strength that is within each one of us. Hopefully, this will be the last tour of the Holocaust, and the next tour will be of the Beis HaMikdash, celebrating together in the rebuilt Yerushalayim. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening, and I want to give an incredible, profound, and special shout out to Mrs. Tracy Schultz, who has been here, as usual, taking care of all the logistic elements of this program and so many other things that the Kollel does. Our opportunity to learn together is thanks to her behind-the-scenes devotion and dedication. So thank you for being our tech person, cameraman today. We thank the museum for hosting us, and we thank you all for coming. Be well.